Before we get started, please go over to Amazon.com and grab a copy of my book, Education and Justice. If you have an African-American son in public school, you need this book because I teach you the many ways that public schools mistreat African-American boys and what you can do to help your son. So go over there and get your copy immediately. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get into this video, which I'm going to talk about revisiting or reviving critical race theory, or CRT for short. It is very important that we revive, revisit, that we bring critical race theory back. And I say back because white conservatives attacked it several years ago, a few years ago back during Trump's first administration. And now critical race theory hasn't gone anywhere, but it has been damaged in the minds of a lot of people. Even some of you, when you hear me use the term critical race theory, then you have probably negative connotations about critical race theory because white conservatives did such a great job at attacking it and making it toxic. All right. So we need to revive it because we need it to fight the current doings of Project 2025 and its aftermath. All right, so we need critical race theory to help us fight, to push back, and then to recover some of what we have lost in Trump 1 and Trump 2. We lost in Trump 1, and we have lost big time already in Trump 2. And we're just getting through the first year. There are 3 more years of this. And so what we end up losing may be tremendous by the time it's all said and done. And we're going to have to rebuild. We're going to have to recover some of what we're losing now. And critical race theory is an important tool to help us do just that. Just think about it. If it wasn't important, they would not have attacked it. Anything your enemy attacks that you're doing, that automatically tells you that that thing that they attack must be really important. And critical race theory is an important tool to push back on Project 2025. So, we're going to get into it. It's a little technical, but don't worry. All right? One of the things that I love doing is taking complex legal doctrines and simplifying them. If I can simplify it for me to understand, then I believe it'll be simplified for anyone to understand, just the way my mind works. So don't go anywhere. Just stay here with me throughout this video and you're going to learn a lot. That's what I'm about. I'm about empowering our people to fight back against MAGA. All right, let's go to another screen and get started with this video. So one of the books that I'm going to use is this book entitled Critical Race Theory, an Introduction. Critical Race Theory, an Introduction. It's a very good book. I've read it from cover to cover, and it introduces the reader to critical race theory, or CRT. Now, there are bunches of books and articles and journals and law review articles and so forth that are out there about critical race theory. But I hope to give you enough of a foundation of an introduction for you to be able to pick up some of those books, pick up some of those articles, and dive even deeper than I will take you in this video. All right, so let's start first of all with this gentleman. He has passed. His name, Derek Bell, professor and civil rights attorney, Derek Bell. He was a Harvard professor, a very renowned civil rights attorney. And he's considered the father figure of CRT, of critical race theory. Now, who is this gentleman? This is the gentleman who attacked critical race theory back during Trump's first administration. He is the one who blew it up, made it toxic, calls people all over the country to say critical race theory is bad, is awful, is demonic, is this and that, although those people knew nothing about critical race theory. But when MAGA uses its machine, its media machine through social media and main media, it is very effective at co-opting terms that we have used in our fight against racism. So not only critical race theory, but woke. They took that term and demonized it, right? DEI. They took that term and demonized it. Critical race theory, CRT, is one of those tools that we need. So we're going to revive it. We're going to revisit critical race theory. All right, what is critical race theory? The critical race theory, CRT movement, is a collection of activists and scholars engaged in studying and transforming the relationship among three things: race, racism, and power. Race, racism, and power. The movement considers many of the same issues that conventional civil rights and ethnic studies discourses take up, but places them in a broader perspective that includes economics, history, setting, group, and self-interest, and emotions and the unconscious. Now, let me break that down and tell you simply what this means. So, critical race theory simply deconstructs the law, civil rights law, other types of law, economics, history, these various ethnic studies, these various disciplines and fields, deconstructs them, and basically asks the question, why, if we have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, as well as the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, and various other laws, why are there still African American people who are caught in a cycle of what many people describe as second-class citizenship? If we got these powerful laws on the books, why do we still see many of the same issues that our community suffered decades ago? Now, don't get me wrong. We've made a lot of beautiful progress. A lot of it, beautiful progress. Poverty rate is down substantially since the mid-'60s. But then for many other African Americans, they just have not seen that progress to the same degree as others. And so crits, as they are called, and I am a critical race theorist, I embrace, I adhere to the ideology of critical race theory. And So we're just simply trying to ask the question and provide answers as to why so many of our brothers and sisters still suffer. It's almost like Dr. King when he gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. He really went there not to talk about the dream that he had, but he went there essentially indicting America, saying, you wrote a check to us through the Declaration of Independence, through all these laws, but that check returned insufficient funds. So critical race theory, in essence, does the same thing. Why are we not seeing the progress, more progress, that we want to see? Yeah, the progress has been great for many African Americans, but many just haven't seen it. So that's what critical race theory does. Derek Bell and many others back in the 70s and 80s, they began to ask these questions because they noticed that the civil rights movement began to lag. Again, the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, Fair Housing Act, and other things that LBJ did and with the push of the civil rights movement were great, but then everything sort of slowed down. And today we're facing all kinds of inequities and gaps, achievement gap, economic gap, wealth gap. What happened? And how can we restart it? Well, critical race theory is the tool that legal scholars, attorneys, and other professionals, experts, was using to try and figure that out. And that study thus far revealed about 5 or 6 tenets, if you will, that I'm going to show you in this video. And these 5 or 6 things explain to a large degree why we don't see more progress. And just think about it. You see, a lot of things are cyclic. There's nothing new under the sun, the Bible tells us. When Derek Bell and his colleagues and peers began to create critical race theory, this was in the 80s, 90s, like I said, the 70s, 80s. And it was right after he wrote the book in 92, this book that we're looking at. And that was right after the Reagan administration. And the Reagan administration did exactly what Trump is doing now, roll back a bunch of programs and things. The Reagan administration was just very antagonistic towards civil rights, just like the Trump administration is. And so Derek Bell and those scholars said, how can we recover? So here we are, 40 years later, and we're dealing with this white backlash all over again. It's just that this time it's even worse. All right. So let's keep moving. Critical race theory sprang up in the 70s as a number of lawyers, activists, legal scholars across the country realized more or less simultaneously that the heady advances of the civil rights era of the 1960s had stalled and in many respects were being rolled back. Okay, as I was just saying, and what we're experiencing now, realizing that new theories and strategies were needed to combat the subtler forms of racism that were gaining ground. Early writers such as Derek Bell, Alan Freeman, Richard Delgado put their minds to the task. All right, so now let me share with you the tenets of critical race theory. These are basic tenets, basic beliefs of critical race theory, and they explain why civil rights stalled. All right. So, tenet number one, racism is not rare or exceptional. It functions as the normal way American society operates. So, racism is not an aberration. It's not an exception to the rule. It is as American as apple pie and baseball. So, racism is a part of our society. Whites deny that. Whites deny that. Blacks even deny that. Tim Scott said that America is not a racist country. Well, he was really hitting at this first tenet of critical race theory. And you remember back when Christopher Rufo was attacking critical race theory, that was the thing they used to fight against critical race theory. They were saying that critical race theory was being taught in high school and middle school and elementary school and dividing whites from blacks by saying that America's racist. Well, America is racist. We have empirical proof and evidence to show that America is still racist. Just because the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, in other words, just because Jim Crow was dismantled, does not mean racism stopped at some point. In fact, we're dealing with a very virulent form of racism right now. All right. For people of color, racial bias shows up in daily life across schools, housing, policing, work, and politics. Seeing racism as ordinary explains why reform moves slowly and why surface fixes fail to change deeper structures. Because racism is so normal. It is in the water. You could say it is the water. It's in the air. It's a part of the American culture. This ordinariness protects the status quo and makes it harder to achieve structural change. Because it feels normal to the dominant group, they rarely see it or treat it as urgent. That's why they deny it. Because it's so normal, they don't detect it. We know otherwise because we are victims of it all the time. From microaggressions, right, to outright racial discrimination, to, in some cases, racial hostility. We know it still exists. They deny it. But because it is so normal and so ordinary, whites deny that it happens, that it still exists. And if they do acknowledge it, they only acknowledge it on the individual level and not the systemic level. And we can never fall for that. We're not talking about just individual racism. We're talking about systemic racism, racism in the systems of this country. All right, second tenet. Second, racism stays embedded because the system of white over color advantage delivers material gains to white elites and psychic benefits to white workers. That's really important. So the white elites, the billionaires, the millionaires, they profit wildly from critical race theory. Whereas the average white person has more wealth than blacks, but still nowhere near where the white elites are. But because both groups are prospering, again, the white elites more so than the regular white person whose benefits oftentimes is more sort of psychological, right? They benefit psychologically from just being white. So that's why it's hard to fight it, because we're fighting both groups. If we could ever get the working white person to see that the policies behind much of what they vote for hurt them as much as they hurt black people, we could make some serious progress in inroads, not only for black Americans, but for all working people. But because regular working people have that psychological benefit more so than, the financial benefits, they fight to hold on to this racist system that we have here. So this goes on to say this creates little incentive to erase it. Colorblind equality only fixes the most blatant discrimination and leaves the deeper structure untouched. Derek Bell argued that even Brown versus Board of Education served white interests more than black liberation. All right. Third tenet. Race is not a biological fact. All right. We are not biologically much different as humans. I mean, the difference is negligible between a white man and a black man and an Asian man and a Latino man, an Arab man, an African, an African American, and so on. There's very, 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 very little negligible difference between us physically. So race is not a biological fact. It is a social invention shaped by power, politics, and economic interests. The concept of white wasn't even a thing until about the 14th, 15th centuries, when Europeans figured out that this racial construct would be able for them to take advantage of everybody who is non-white. But before then, the world was not inundated with race. Of course, we've always had ethnicity, but not white, black, and all that. That's a social construct. Physical traits like skin color or hair texture represent a tiny share of human genetic differences and do not determine intelligence, personality, or moral behavior. Yet institutions treat these traits as if they signal fixed group qualities. This practice helps maintain hierarchy and mask the truth that race functions as a political tool, not a scientific reality. So this is the third tenet of critical race theory, that race is not biological, it is political. All right? And the second tenet is that the interests of rich white people converge with the interests of working and poor class white people. The rich white people get financial benefits. The working poor white people get psychological benefits, which makes them also protective of the racism in our system. So that makes it hard to fight. All right? Fourth tenet. CRT explains that society changes how it labels minority groups in response to political and economic needs. What does that mean? That means during slavery, African Americans were very valuable because we were chattel property. Once slavery ended, we lost some of that value. And then you jump into the 20th and 21st centuries, we see various changes in the value of minorities. I said in a recent video that non-white people are either usable or useless with white people. If we're not usable, then we're useless. And for quite some time, Latino Americans were, very valuable in the eyes of whites. So much so that in many spaces they replaced us. But now we see that they're being deported in record numbers, which suggests that Latino Americans are not as valuable in the eyes of whites as they once were. And especially when you consider the fact that whites are fearful of losing the country. But one of the reasons why Latino Americans have lost some value in the eyes of whites is because of robotics and AI and technology and so on. All right? So critical race theory, CRT, explains that society changes how it labels minority groups in response to political and economic needs. Groups are praised when they are useful and targeted when they are feared. Japanese Americans were farm laborers in one era and security threats in another. Muslims were once viewed as unusual neighbors, then cast as dangers after geopolitical shifts. Stereotypes rise and fall with these changes, showing race functions as a tool of control, not a fixed truth. So as economic needs change, then the value that the white power structure places on minorities change as well. All right, now the fifth tenet. CRT holds that people who live with racial oppression develop insights about race that white Americans often miss. Their lived experiences create a capacity to explain how racism operates in daily life and within the legal system. The legal storytelling movement urges Black, Latino, Asian, and Native writers to share these experiences to challenge official narratives that hide or distort racial reality. So that's very true. We, African Americans and other non-whites, can share experiences with whites and others about racism that whites don't have and oftentimes don't understand. But they can understand better if we're telling the story rather than them telling the story. And quite often, it is white liberals and white progressives who insist on telling our stories. And critical race theory says, no, white liberal, white progressives, sit down and listen to the story of the people who are at the bottom of the well. They can tell you exactly how racism operates. All right? So that's the fifth tenet of critical race theory. Now, one other thing before we leave this book and get into another book is critical race theory is critical of liberalism and color blindness. Now, you may be surprised to hear that. Why would critical race theorists be critical of liberalism, liberals, and colorblindness? Well, here's why. As mentioned earlier, critical race scholars are discontented with liberalism as a framework for addressing America's racial problems. Many liberals believe in colorblindness and neutral principles of constitutional law. I'm going to explain this in just a moment. They believe in equality, especially equal treatment for all persons, regardless of their different histories or current situations. Some even manage to convince themselves that with the election of Barack Obama, we arrived at a post-racial stage of social development. I'll come back to that in a moment. But liberals embrace this concept of doing things slowly, in increments. Don't push it. Don't rush it. That's what Dr. King addressed in his letter from a Birmingham jail. They wanted him to slow up. And we don't have time to slow up. We've been waiting 400 years for equity and parity. So we don't have time to wait on the liberal comfortableness of progress. We want, as Dr. King said, there is this fierce urgency of now. Many of our people are suffering. We can't wait another 50 years, another 100 years. And then color blindness. All right, I'm going to read some about color blindness in just a moment, so I won't jump ahead of that. But let me also just address this post-racial thing that folks embraced when Barack Obama was elected president and reelected. Now, I absolutely celebrate the election and reelection of the first black president. I jumped on the bandwagon early. Voted for Obama twice. All right? Didn't agree with everything he did and critiqued him where I felt necessary. But I absolutely celebrated when that man was elected. I understood what had just happened. I thought about my mother, my father who had all passed, my grandmother, grandfather. I thought about my ancestors. And I just knew that they couldn't even fathom a day when a black man would be elected president. And don't you tell me that his election was symbolic, because Obama accomplished a lot. Despite all the opposition and resistance he received while he was in office. And most especially the Affordable Care Act, which ensures about 4 million black people to this day. 4 million black people out of about 40 million, that's about 10% of black folks who have health insurance because of what that black man did. And that's not all that he did. But despite all that, I knew that Obama's election and reelection was not a post-racial moment. In other words, it was not an indication that America had overcome its racism. Anybody who thought that was just simply naive and being foolish. So it was not a post-racial moment at all. And we found out very quickly, especially some of the racist things that they said about the man. And if you remember, Trump spent years attacking his birthright citizenship. So, colorblindness. Colorblindness can be admirable, as when a governmental decision maker refuses to give in to local prejudices. But it can be perverse, for example, when it stands in the way of taking account of difference in order to help people in need. An extreme version of colorblindness seen in certain Supreme Court opinions today holds that it is wrong for the law to take any note of race, even to remedy a historical wrong. This is really, 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 really important. So let me just repeat and mirror what they just said, what this says. Colorblindness is good when color or race is being taken in consideration to benefit, right? To benefit one person and harm another. That's exactly what whites have done throughout the history of this country. Right? So when the government wants to harm somebody because of their race, colorblindness is a good thing. But when people such as African American people have been harmed by the racist policies of this country. Taking their color in consideration is a good thing so that you can remedy the harms that they've suffered, that we've suffered. How can you remedy our harms as African Americans if you're saying, well, the law is colorblind, so we can't do anything for you because if we did something for you, then that's gonna be a disadvantage to somebody else. So what? In this instance, when we have been harmed. So taking race in consideration to remedy past racial discrimination is a good thing. It's a good thing. And as I said earlier, in Dr. King's speech, white conservatives took the phrase in that speech when Dr. King said, I dream for the day where my kids will be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. They took that and ran with it. And it's not what Dr. King was saying. He was not saying that he didn't want color or didn't think that color should ever be taken in consideration. As I said, it should be when it is intended to redress past wrongs. Other than that, no. And that's the very logic they use to get rid of affirmative action and DEI. And that's the way they have also gutted, basically weakened the Equal Protection Clause in the Civil Rights Act. That's the very argument that they make. That's what Clarence Thomas is saying now to try to get rid of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. That if you create a voting district to make blacks the majority of that district, then by taking color into consideration, you violate the Equal Protection Clause. Well, no, you don't if you are righting a wrong. If you're taking in consideration color to right a past wrong, that does not or should not violate the Equal Protection Clause. That is really, really important. And it's how they've actually turned the Equal Protection Clause against us. All right? Critical race theorists, or crits, as they are sometimes called, hold that color blindness of the latter forms will allow us to redress only extremely egregious racial harms, ones that everyone would notice and condemn. But if racism is embedded in our thought processes, in social structures as deeply as many crits believe, then the ordinary business of society, the routines, practices, and institutions that we rely on to do the world's work will keep minorities in subordinate positions. Precisely. Only aggressive, color-conscious efforts to change the way things are will do much to ameliorate misery. As an example of one such strategy, one critical race scholar proposed that society look to the bottom in judging new laws. If they would not relieve the distress of the poorest group, or worse, if they compound it, we should reject them. Although color blindness seems firmly entrenched in the judiciary, a few judges have made exceptions in unusual circumstances. So all that is saying is there are times where a group's color should and need to be taken in consideration in order to redress past wrongs. And if you don't do that, then that's one of the reasons why racism continues because the color blindness doctrine hamstrings courts from doing real things to address the racism because they can't look at a person's color. And they have gotten that deeply embedded in the law. All right? Affirmative action is one of the best examples here recently. The SFFA case, Students for Fair Admission, when they sued Harvard and UNC, Chapel Hill, and argued that by taking diversity in consideration, it was unfair to whites and Asians. Never mind the fact that universities in the country at large had discriminated against blacks for centuries. And that relegated us to second-class citizenship for many, 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 many decades. And so folks on that original affirmative action case, Bakke versus California, Justice Thurgood Marshall and others argued that affirmative action should be based on remedying or redressing past racial discrimination, not just diversity. But they went with diversity. And so as soon as SCOTUS was able to gut affirmative action, they did so. And affirmative action should not have been gutted until there was no more racism. But the color blindness doctrine prevents that. All right, so that is an introduction. There's more. I was going to get into another book by Dr. Bell. Let me show you. I was going to get into this book here. Let's see here. This book, Faces at the Bottom of the Well. I was going to read some of that, but the video has gone 42 minutes now, so I'll stop here. But I'll do a part 2 because he says some very, very good stuff in this book, Faces at the Bottom of the Well. But that, again, is a basic introduction of critical race theory and why we need those 5 tenets to fight Project 2025 and Trump's anti-woke agenda, his anti-critical race agenda. All right. They intentionally attacked critical race theory because it made a very strong argument against exactly what we see them doing now in Project 2025. You see, we deal with some extremely tactical, strategic adversaries. Oftentimes, they're 10, 15, 20, 50, 100 years ahead of us. And then are able to even solicit and elicit the help of African Americans to work against other African Americans. Because I heard blacks who really didn't understand critical race theory themselves become critical of critical race theory, not knowing what they're talking about. Never read any books. But anything white conservatives say, they're sycophants. And they show a lot of obeisance to white conservatives, so they jump on the bandwagon. But we must revive CRT because it is an extremely effective tool at fighting Project 2025 and other racist ideologies. All right. I am Reverend and Civil Rights Attorney Augustus Corbett. Thank you for watching this video. And stay woke.